Today, we gather as a tribunal to determine whether the scout has committed a war crime. The charges brought upon this court regard the recent incident in Bathroom Approach where the scout threatened the Ducky by summary execution as seen here. Today, this court will determine whether the scout is guilty of war crimes. Now, just to note that the ending cutscene in both easy and hard mode is actually slightly different. However, the only real difference is that in easy mode, it's Ducky Doom III that's getting destroyed, whereas in hard mode, it is the Mecha Bunny that's actually destroyed. Now, this makes more sense given the fact that Ducky actually controls the bunny mech, so it makes more sense that the Ducky is seen here being threatened by the scout, whereas it had no real physical participation in easy mode because it wasn't the one controlling Ducky Doom. Now, this tribunal only counts the contributions of the scout because the dispatcher did not say to execute the Duck. The dispatcher only said, just bring the shard back to base. It said nothing about recruiting the Duck, nor did it say anything about a summary execution of the Duck without due process. This is entirely the scout acting on his own volition to summarily execute the Duck. Now, this court will now adjourn to determine whether the scout actually has any mitigating circumstances that prevent the scouts from being executed for a summary execution of the Duck. Now, the biggest contributing factor is that the scout actually never killed the Duck. There is an alternative timeline when the scout does actually shoot the Duck. And as an aside, developers, I want to see this as like a 1% chance cutscene. And in fact, the developers did actually storyboard this. Well, not sure if they storyboarded this or this was used with the assets made for the storyboard for the main animation. Because here, it's not the scout doing it, it's some grey humanoid doing it. It's not the scout as we see in the game. But this grey humanoid looking thing does actually shoot the Duck. However, even in this picture, we don't see the Duck brain being blown out. Therefore, we cannot tell based on this evidence that the Duck actually dies from this shot. Back to the main timeline at hand, the scout clearly does show the intention of killing the Duck before his brain takes over and denies the shot. But why didn't the soldier do this? Why didn't the pyromancer do this? Well, actually, the answer lies within the logbooks. You see, the entry for the Super Soldier Ducky is in reference to the scout. So here, Super Soldier Duck is what beat performance looks like. He is the type to take himself too seriously and can be overdramatic when it comes to his dramatization of past events, telling insane mission stories like flying a jet through a train tunnel and kidnapping someone named Scout. Although who knows what stories are true. Again, this is not admissible evidence in this court. However, this does imply that the Super Soldier Ducky may have taken the scout hostage throughout this entire situation. Therefore, meaning that we have a motive for the scout. The scout was likely tortured by the army of ducks sent by Ducky. Bearing in mind that it's the Duck who commands the entire duck army. As you can see here, he is doing a political speech like a certain Austrian pater in the small disagreement of 1939 to 1945. He mentions we must work together to take our revenge to those who wronged us. He did not for 1 second consider the fact that there could have been a disruption in supply lines. Therefore, it is likely in this situation, the starting situation where the scout makes first contact with the ducks, this is where the scout was likely kidnapped by the ducks and tortured for information against the TDS organization. Also, I just realised that there's welder duckies here, but these welder duckies aren't actually seen in the game. I wonder if there's a scrap duck somewhere in there. I mean, I know like the welder ducks are seen here, but they also are seen welding the bunny turrets, which we use against them. Anyways, that provides mitigation for the scout and his motives of why he wants to kill the Duck. It is under the Duck that the scout was tortured and kidnapped from the TDS organization while in battle. We don't know the torture methods put upon the scout. And it's not this court's job to determine what the methods of torture that a scout had to endure. However, we can interpret this by the amount of ducks that the Ducky sends and the type of ducks that it sends. Now, it's very clear that the Duck has its own professional military army, as seen with the Ducky unit, the Mega Ducky, and the Elite Ducky. Basically, we know that the Duck Society does have an army. However, Ducky is seen using civilians such as this duck, and in fact this is actually a duckling filled with gentle quacks and boundless possibilities. Could they become an agent, a pilot, a spy? These are civilians. These are newborn civilians. If the Duck is absolutely a-okay by sending citizens into battle in comparison to the military dons, such as the Ducky unit. We can only therefore speculate that the scout had to endure so much physical pain and torture through his kidnapping by the super soldier Ducky. We don't know if he was taken prisoner of war, but likely, given that it was a super soldier Ducky that mentions kidnapping someone called the scout, it means that it is likely that the scout was never a prisoner of war here, and likely was kidnapped against his own will. Bearing in mind, to become a prisoner of war, you have to consentfully surrender yourself to the enemy. Now, there are rare circumstances where you can take someone by force, and it is likely that the scout never actually used force in the first place. And given the fact that the nerd duck was the person, well, I wouldn't say person, more like the duck, who started this whole endeavor of essentially mass enslavement against the TDS organization, basically state-sponsored slavery, it is fair that the nerd duck is taken by force, as is the case here. However, to do a summary execution is likely against the Geneva Conventions, because the nerd duck, as seen here, is unarmed. In this case, that would mean that the nerd duck is technically a prisoner of war. And as the Geneva Convention states, if you have a prisoner of war, you must treat them with due respect and dignity. Threatening them with death, summary execution, is against the Geneva Conventions. Now, obviously, there is the existential question whether or not the Geneva Conventions actually apply within this dimension. The dispatcher states multiple times that this is the Ducky dimension, therefore, meaning that technically speaking, this may not be under the jurisdictions of the Geneva Conventions. However, given the fact that this world seems to act very similar to planet Earth, we can only assume that this is within the same realms as planet Earth. And given the fact that Professor V does hire the nerd duck, it does mean that the institutions within this Ducky dimension is similar to those of planet Earth, therefore meaning that we can safely assume that the Geneva Conventions apply in this dimension. Now, the next article of violation is whether or not the nerd duck is a child, therefore meaning that the scout has technically threatened someone with a summary execution who is a child, who is a minor. And as we know, we cannot execute minors because, well, I think the Red Cross will have something to say about that. Now, the only evidence of the nerd duck's age is that Professor V recognizes the abilities of the nerd duck, saying that you're the smart one who engineered this all by yourself, and essentially hires him as part of her team. Now, she does bribe him with bread, but in this dark dimension, bread seems to be the currency that is used for trading in lieu of payments in the form of currency. After all, that is why they attacked. They only attacked because their portal went down and we couldn't provide them bread anymore. In this circumstance, it therefore means that the nerd duck is likely of age, of criminal responsibility, therefore meaning that we really can't consider him a child. Yes, he's a small duck in comparison to other ducks. He does mention this while attacking us towards the later stages of the hard mode. However, being short is not indicative of being a child. For example, Lionel Messi is considered quite short, being 5'7". Wait, 5'7"? I'm actually taller than Lionel Messi. Oh, fair enough. So, to conclude the tribunal against war crimes committed in Bathroom Approach, we can say that the scout has violated the Geneva Conventions by threatening an unarmed prisoner with summary execution. Also, isn't the hiring of the nerd ducks very similar to the circumstances after the small disagreement of 1945, where some German scientists were hired by NASA even though they may have committed war crimes? I'm just saying, Professor V, there might be a war criminal within your ranks. Just saying. However, I have considered the mitigating circumstances that the Scout has provided through its commanders and through logbook entries of what the Ducks have done on their side, and therefore determined that the Scout will not get the death penalty. However, I will recommend to the dispatcher that the Scout be disciplined for his lack of prior judgment before threatening the nerd duck with summary execution. Whether the nerd duck acted like a certain Austrian painter from 1939 to 1945 in the second small disagreement, that is not up to the Scout to determine. After all, the Scout is light infantry. It is not a commander, nor is it a judge of crimes. They are not allowed to determine whether or not someone has committed a war crime. His only task was to secure the God Cube fragment and take it back to its realm, because the God Cube fragment was secured by the Pyromancer as seen in the cutscene, and he knows this. He looks at the Pyromancer take the God Cube out of the bunny mech. He knows the war is over. Therefore, he does threaten a citizen with summary execution. This is vigilanteism at its finest, and we at the TDS organization do not condone this type of behavior. The Scout will get a polite talking to stop this behavior once and for all. And then we'll give him some badges for his kidnapped by the Ducks. So yes, the scout has committed a war crime, but he will not be executed for it. Meeting adjourned.